Hello, my name is Carrie Brown and I am with the Central Mississippi Regional Library System. Today, I'm going to be reading to you chapters 5 and 6 of A to Z Mysteries, The Empty Envelope. Written by Ron Roy, illustrated by John Stephen Gurney, published by Random House, New York. Chapter 5. I'm going to boil some water, Ruth Rose said. My grandfather used to collect stamps. He showed me how to steam 'em off envelopes. Ruth Rose ran water into the tea kettle and set the kettle on the burner. Then she turned on the stove. The kids sat and stared at it. Sure is taking a long time to boil, Dink muttered, brushing his fingertips over the sunflower stamps. Suddenly steam began whistling out of the kettle spout. Dink handed Ruth Rose the empty envelope. Ruth Rose held the envelope so the stamps were right over the kettle spout. In a few seconds, moisture began gathering on the stamps. Then the stamps began to peel away from the envelope. "Cool," Josh said. "I feel like a spy." Ruth Rose shut off the stove. Using the tip of a toothpick, she removed the 3 sunflower stamps from the envelope. Hidden beneath the stamps, covered with cellophane, was a smaller stamp. It was blue. In the center of the stamp was a picture of an old-fashioned airplane. The plane was flying upside down. Dink removed the cellophane. "It's an old stamp," he said. Josh poked a finger at the stamp. "The dumb thing is printed wrong," he muttered. "What's the big deal about an upside-down airplane stamp?" Ruth Rose studied the stamp. "Maybe it's valuable," she said. "My grandfather has a stamp that's worth $200. "I wonder if Doris Duncan knew this was here," Dink said. The kids looked at each other. Then they stared at the little blue stamp. "We should go to the library and look at a book about stamps," Ruth Rose said finally. Dink glanced at the kitchen clock. "We better make it fast. Doris Duncan will be back in less than an hour." Dink slipped the stamp inside the empty envelope and stuck all 5 envelopes under his shirt. "Okay, let's go," he said. Ruth Rose went to the bottom of the hall stairs. "Mom, I'm going to the library," she yelled. They hurried through the living room, out the door, and down Ruth Rose's front sidewalk. As they started up Woody Street, Josh nudged Dink with his elbow. "Look, there's some weird guy watching us." He pointed at a dark car parked on the other side of the street. Ruth Rose looked. "What guy?" They all looked. There was no one in that car. "Come on," Dink said. "We're running out of time." The kids ran all the way to the library. When they charged up the front steps, they were out of breath. Mrs. McElroy looked up as they burst through the door. "Slow down, kids," she said. "Why, your faces are red as beets." "Hi, Miss McElroy," Ruth Rose panted. "Can you show us a book about stamps?" "What kind of stamps, Ruth Rose? United States? Foreign? We have many, many books about stamps, dear." "Do you have one about stamps with pictures of upside-down airplanes?" Dink asked. Mrs. McElroy smiled. "You mean inverts?" she said. "Stamps that were printed upside down by mistake?" She walked to a shelf and returned with a big, flat book. "You should find your stamp in here," Mrs. McElroy said. "Thanks a lot," Dink said. Dink carried the book over to a corner table. He sat it down, looked around, then pulled the envelopes from inside his shirt. He carefully removed the blue stamp and placed it on the table. "There's a zillion upside-down stamps in here," Josh said, rifling through the pages. "How do we find ours?" "Try the index," Dink said, "under Jenny." Josh turned to the index in the back of the book. He ran his finger down the J section. "No Jenny," he said. "Try looking under airplanes," Ruth Rose suggested. "Good idea." Josh backed up a few pages to the A's. He found a listing for airplanes and turned to page 329. And there it was, a picture of the little blue stamp. Below the picture was a drawing of the airplane, only bigger. The caption read, "Curtis Jenny single-engine airplane." "Hey!" Josh said. "Jenny's the airplane!" Silently, the kids read the paragraph about the stamp. "Oh my gosh!" Ruth Rose yelled. Mrs. McElroy tapped her pencil on the desk. "Ruth Rose, please," she said. Dink picked up the little Jenny stamp. His fingers were shaking. "This is worth $50,000, he whispered. Chapter 6. 50 thou, holy moly, Josh squeaked. The kids stared at the small blue stamp. After a minute, Dink slipped it back inside the envelope and put it in his pocket. No wonder Doris Duncan came all the way to Connecticut, Ruth Rose said. Dink nodded. Yeah, she was after the stamp the whole time. I knew that story about her mother smelled fishy. Josh closed the stamp book. Well, we still have to give the stamp to her. Dink and Ruth Rose looked at each other. Don't we? Josh asked. I guess, Dink said. What do you mean, I guess? Josh said. It's hers, Dink. It was on her letter, no matter who sent it to her. But why was it hidden? Dink asked. Why the whole story about Doris's mother? Why the fake letters? Unless what? Josh asked. Dink looked at Josh and Ruth Rose. Unless the stamp is stolen. Yes, Ruth Rose said. It's worth so much money. Maybe Bird stole it. Then he or she had to find a way to get it to Doris, so they thought up the letters from Mother. Josh just looked at them. You guys are crazy, he finally said. Besides, there's no way to be sure. Ruth Rose jumped up. Bird sent the letters from New York, right? Maybe that's where the stamp was stolen. Ruth Rose hurried over to Mrs. McElroy's desk, spoke to her quickly, then came back. What's going on? Dink asked. Mrs. McElroy is getting us the last few weeks' New York Times, Ruth Rose said. We can check to see if there's anything about a missing stamp. Dink looked at the clock. 5:15. Doris Duncan will be at my house in 45 minutes. Mrs. McElroy walked over and dumped a pile of New York Timeses on their table. Here you are, kids. Good luck. Josh stared at the mountain of papers. Geez, it'll take us all night to read these. We don't have all night, Dink said, reaching for the pile. Start reading. The kids each took a stack. They set aside the sections they didn't want, like sports, real estate, and entertainment. For almost half an hour, they turned pages. The clock above Mrs. McElroy's desk ticked the minutes away. My eyes are getting blurry, Josh said. There sure is a lot of stolen stuff in New York. Some guy even stole a chimpanzee from the zoo. Dink's back was hurting from bending over the table. His head ached, too, and his fingers were smudged gray from ink. And then he found it. Here it is, Dink said. He pointed to a headline and read, Senior Citizen Finds, Then Loses Fortune. June 20th. Miss Clementine Painter, 73, was rich for a short time. But now she's poor again. While emptying her vacuum cleaner, she found a rare stamp among the dust. The stamp, worth more than $50,000, was later stolen from her room. New York City police are investigating. Josh gulped. You were right, Dink, he whispered. You can't give the stamp to Doris Duncan. Mrs. McElroy approached their table. I have to close up soon, she said. Dink whipped his head around to look at the clock. 5:48! Guys, we have 12 minutes before Doris Duncan comes back to my house. The kids thanked Mrs. McElroy, stacked the newspapers, and hurried out of the library. On the library steps, Dink said, Maybe we should tell Officer Fallon about Doris Duncan. But we still can't prove she did anything wrong, Josh said. Josh is right, Dink, Ruth Rose said. Doris Duncan never got the letters or the stamp. If you tell Officer Fallon that she and Bird stole it, they'll say, prove it. But what am I going to do? Dink asked. It's almost 6 o'clock. I have to tell Doris Duncan something. The kids began walking toward Woody Street. I have an idea, Ruth Rose said. Why don't we glue the sunflower stamps back on the empty envelope, then hand over all 5 letters to Doris Duncan? She'll probably take them to her hotel room to read. Then we can run back here, give the Jenny stamp to Officer Fallon, and tell him the whole story. But how does that prove she's guilty? Dink asked. Because then she'll have the letters, Josh said. Ruth Rose nodded. And when Officer Fallon gets the letters from Doris and reads the hidden message, he'll know she and Bird stole the stamp. Dink grinned. Right. Then we can show him what we just found in the newspaper. Okay, let's go. As they hurried down the library steps, Dink saw a dark car pull away from the curb. Hey, Josh, isn't that the same car you saw parked on my street? He asked. Yeah, and the same weird-looking guy is driving, Josh said. Josh, there wasn't anyone in that car, Ruth Rose said. Maybe he ducked down when you looked, Josh said, but I know I saw someone in the driver's seat. Whoever it is, we have to get going, Dink said. It's nearly 6 o'clock. The kids ran up Main Street. They took a shortcut through Center Park, then raced past the Rose Garden. They were out of breath by the time they reached Woody Street. A few houses away from Dink's, Josh suddenly grabbed Dink and Ruth Rose. He yanked them down behind Mrs. Albicky's front hedge. "What's wrong?" Dink asked. "That same car is parked in front of your house again," Josh said. The kids peered over the hedge. A man and woman got out of the car. Dink recognized Doris Duncan. The man was short and dressed in a green suit and purple tie. "That's him," Josh whispered. "The guy I saw in the car before." The kids watched Doris and the man talk for a few minutes, then get back in the car. But the car didn't drive away. "What the heck are they doing?" Josh asked. Dink gulped. He put his hand over the envelope holding the $50,000 stamp. "They're waiting for me," he said. Thank you. Be sure to tune in next week for chapters 7, 8, and 9. Goodbye.